Hey, welcome to our first unit, learning about the past. And this is lesson 1. And we're talking about history and historians. So history is the study of past events, particularly dealing with past events in regards to people. And historians are people who study the past and are considered experts in the field of history. When studying history, it's not about memorizing names and dates. History is about finding out how people lived, what happened to them, what happened around them. And we look more in detail on history. We look for the reasons on why the events happened and the effects of these events. Historians analyze and evaluate information from the past in order to draw conclusions, better understand these events, and make connections with other events. And these are really our course objectives here. Examine themes in a world history and changes over time, analyze and evaluate past events, including the causes and effects from perspectives of various groups, evaluating the credibility from a historical perspective, and use the inquiry process to determine what happened in history. So during the course of this class, you're going to have to use these things to apply history, not memorize history necessarily. Historians determine what happened, why an event happened, and how an event happened. And historians and other researchers have a variety of methods and processes they use to learn about the past, and we're going to talk about those. So what happened, why an event happened, and how the event happened. So in many ways, historians are like detectives. Detectives ask questions, search for clues, analyze, interpret evidence, and draw conclusions to determine what happened. Historians do the same thing. They ask questions, they find resources, which are similar to clues, analyze and interpret information or evidence, and draw conclusions on what they think happened. And this is called the inquiry process. So ask questions, find resources, analyze and interpret information, and draw conclusions, similar to what detectives do. Historians are also a lot like scientists. So historians and other researchers learn about the past using a variety of methods and processes similar to how scientists learn and predict things. So in many ways, historians are similar to scientists. Scientists use scientific method to search as a system of research, identify a problem, gathering information, formulating and testing hypothesis, and generating a conclusion. And archaeologists use something similar called the archaeological method to learn about the past, surveying, excavating sites, recording, preserving, and sharing information. So surveying, searching for and finding the locations. Once they find a location, they carefully search and dig to find evidence, and then they make interpretations and conclusions drawn on these evidence they find. They try to test this to see if it makes sense, look for various other possibilities, and then they preserve this evidence for later people to see and prevent it from being destroyed, and then they share and publish their information and constantly look for more and more information to kind of connect the dots. So we talked about evidence. Evidence is something that's very important for historians. Historians make observations and ask questions. For example, a historian might wonder, how were the Great Pyramids built? In order to answer the question, a historian needs evidence. Historians analyze and evaluate primary sources, secondary sources, and oral histories, which would be spread of information by word of mouth. Historians analyze and interpret primary resources, as we said, secondary sources, and oral history, and we'll talk about each one of these individually now. So a primary source is something that's written or created by someone who saw the historical event firsthand. So they're from someone who is there. It could also be something written by someone who is there firsthand, letters, diaries, speeches, photographs, drawings. And now in modern day standards, you could actually have videotape recordings. You could have all these different things much easier than you could a long time ago. Artifacts are man-made objects of cultural or historical significance, such as simple tools, pottery, jewelry, or clothing. It could be much more than that. And these are also considered primary sources. So we see the picture here of the Constitution, and then you have the picture here of an artifact, in this case, an arrowhead. So secondary source is different than a primary source. It is something written or created by a person who did not see the event. So this is secondhand. It could be like a textbook, a biography, or journal articles. Secondary resource is written or created after the event, and it depends on or is based on primary sources for the information. Prehistory is a period of time before written records, so you have no written records of the events that happened. So to try to figure out what actually happened, we study artifacts, or once again, man-made objects, and we use the archaeological method to find these. Historians use oral history to study cultures without written records, and they study their stories, their customs, their songs passed down from generation to generation. So before written records, we do have some information, but the information is much more difficult to figure out and relying on mostly oral history and artifacts. Solving history's mysteries is kind of like putting together a puzzle. So you have all these different pieces and you have to figure out how they fit together. And in some ways, it's kind of like fitting together a puzzle with extra pieces or missing pieces. So it makes it much more difficult than just your standard puzzle. So historians have to gather as much information about the past as possible, put the information together to answer questions about what happened in the past. But history is imperfect. Sometimes what historians thought was once true turns out to be false. For instance, Napoleon is historically known as being extremely short. Now historians realize that was just a rumor. It was propaganda, and he was actually about average height. Sometimes historians come to differing conclusions based on the same evidence and disagree about what actually happened and how things happened. Historians also have to determine the credibility of a source. So when analyzing and evaluating information or reliant on sources, historians must take into account whether or not these sources are credible. So they have to determine if it's trustworthy, if it has its limitations, bias, accuracy, and context. So on a picture here, you can see the National Enquirer. If you're getting your information from the National Enquirer, chances are it's not very credible source for news. So trustworthiness, can you trust what the source says? Limitations, not many sources are going to have completely what's going on. So you have to take a little bit from each source. Each source is limited on what information they give you, and that's why you need to piece together sources from lots of different places. With ancient history, that's kind of difficult. You have to look for biases, prejudice in favor or against something. Most of the history that we're going to study is actually going to have lots of bias because it's usually written by one side, telling one side of the story. For instance, the Trojan War tells only the story from the Greek perspective, not the Trojan perspective. You have to look at the accuracy of these things and the context in which it was written, so the circumstances in which a term can be fully understood and assessed. So today, even today's sources are very difficult to determine a credibility, and you have to cipher through a lot of things to figure out what's legitimate and what's not. But when looking back thousands and thousands of years, this is going to be even harder to determine what's accurate and what's not, once again, making history difficult to know what's exactly true. Historians have more technology available to them today than it had ever before, and using modern day science, we can learn a lot about things we had no idea about in the past. And we're going to learn later on in this unit about Ötzi, who was a mummy, and the scientists were able to learn a lot about things that happened thousands of years ago by performing studies and tests on his body. You have computer imaging now, you have carbon dating, you have DNA analysts and DNA testing, and you have remote sensing to help you find more and more artifacts and more evidence. So all these things have gone a long ways to help historians learn more about history and determine whether or not what we thought was once true is actually accurate or not, and either reinforcing people's beliefs or coming up with new ideas about what actually happened. All right, that's the end of lesson 1. Thank you for listening. If you have any questions, please email me and let me know, and I'll talk to you guys later. Bye.